Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of Devex, and I'm just delighted for the conversation we're going to have this morning. It has been a real treat and a pleasure to be a part of this Aurora Humanitarian Initiative gathering over the last few days, to see so many of you who are in the room who are humanitarian leaders in your own right, who should be at this table as well, for the incredible work you do around the world. And to have an event that honors you and celebrates you and lifts you up is really powerful and needed at this moment. We at Devex are always covering what's happening in the world of humanitarian response and global development. And I will tell you, usually the headlines are not good. You know this, you know the statistics, you know the stories. They are often rather depressing. The trend lines don't look great in many areas, which is why this event has been such a treat to be a part of. It's been so inspirational, hearing from the laureates, hearing from the organizations that are represented around this room and beyond, and just learning more about the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, which is part of our goal today. And so this is a special treat because we've got the two co-chairs of this year's convening. And this is a special convening for many reasons that we will get into. But it is really an honor to be joined by Noubar Afeyan, who is the co-founder of the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, and to be joined by Érik Ésraylian, who is a co-chair of this year's gathering. He is on the board of the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative. He's also, as you well know, the chief of UCLA's Vatche, Tamar Manoukian Division of Digestive Diseases. He's a philanthropist. He's a film producer. Any one of his titles would be sufficient, but he does many, many things in addition to his important work here at Aurora. And of course, Noubar, as you all well know, is the co-founder of this initiative and is also the founder and CEO of Flagship Pioneering and the co-founder and chairman of Moderna. Again, the two of you in your day jobs do enough to suggest impact in the world, and yet you've decided to create this initiative and this year's gathering. And so I want to get into the conversation with both of you just to begin a little bit about yourselves and your personal motivation. What is it when you think of your career, and Noubar, I'll just begin with you, working at the very cutting edge of biotechnology, trying to drive real impact for patients around the world, that made you say, actually, we need to do something beyond that day job. And we need to reframe and think about some of the tragedies in your own community's history in a totally new light. Just explain for those of us in the room what motivated you to want to do this.
Well, first, thanks for everybody. I feel terrible. People are standing, so if we can get people to come on this side, I'll be a little more comfortable. But anyway, well, look, I would say that I didn't grow up thinking that I'm going to do this kind of work. My family situation was such that my father was displaced to go from Bulgaria to Lebanon because of the communist regime that came into Bulgaria, so they escaped pretty quickly. I was born in Lebanon, and then as a result of the Civil War, we escaped the Civil War in 1975 rather abruptly and found ourselves in Canada. So I'd say my father and mother, who were generous, you know, kind of well-rounded in their life, involved in arts, involved in business, weren't in this type of, you know, philanthropic position, let's say. And growing up, you know, what I had been largely prepared to do was to try to compete and thrive in education and then try to do something useful, but never had any kind of global, I'm dying to see if Érik did, but I certainly did not, global perspectives. I was kind of just trying to get by. I ended up following an entrepreneurial trajectory in my career after doing a PhD at MIT. Was not the common path at all. I ended up kind of thinking that if I was willing to go a little beyond the cutting edge of things, that I'd be alone, and that felt super comfortable because I would say that in hindsight, and I've thought a lot about this, I was uncomfortable in the middle of packs and crowds, and I realized that the only way you can avoid crowds is if you either go really backwards and kind of work on things that nobody wants to work on because it's already been done, or try to go forward and try to work on things that nobody is yet daring to do. And that is, now it's been a 38-year journey of that. So, but to your question, how does that lead to doing this kind of activity? I'd say in the 90s, when I had the first opportunity to have the resources to at least be able to participate in a small way philanthropically, I probably started out trying to do things out of a sense of obligation slash kind of giving back. Initially, it was largely charitable work. We built a school in Armenia back in 97, 98, built a school in small one in Boston to our local community, Armenian also. But then pretty quickly, I ended up realizing that the entrepreneurial skills I had and the opportunity in Armenia to make a difference were at a grander scale than that. So I met, this is not a story I've told at all, I met by quite some chance Ruben Vartanian, who's the co-founder of this initiative, in 2000 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the Henrietta bar or restaurant, by a mutual introduction. Ruben at the time was younger than me, was an investment banker from Russia, spending 2 weeks at Harvard Kennedy School, just trying to figure out the Western ways. This was the time when Soviet Union was, or post-Soviet Union was modernizing. That's the word they were using. And he was very eager to learn and meet people. So we met, and we each, after a little while, thought, like, what are you doing for Armenia? And imagine, he's a Russian Armenian. His English was broken. And he said, well, I'm doing stuff in Russia. I'm trying to help Russia figure out what it could become. And I said, well, I'm not doing anything much in Armenia other than giving money for a church and a school. And we decided on the spot that we would try to combine our efforts and go on this journey, because neither one of us know what to do. So, when you don't know what you're doing, company is appreciated. If you know what you're doing, company slows you down. But we figured, so literally he went back to Russia. I came, I went, across the river home. And we then started this project called Armenia 2020, and I'll accelerate, which was essentially back in 2001 an attempt to envision what Armenia could become, come up with some alternative choices, figure out what the limitations are to getting to a desired outcome, and then start working backwards to connect the future with the present. That notion is what's guided everything we've done since. Armenia 2020 was a multi-year project. We created scenarios. We created a competitive strategy for the country. That led to a lot of projects in Armenia, social economic development projects in education and healthcare and in tourism, kind of ecotourism development clusters, science technology since then. But then in 2014, it took a bit of a sharp turn towards the humanitarian side, prompted largely, doing work in Armenia to do economic development when it's a poor place is itself a humanitarian activity, only because people were in utter poverty. But the centennial of the Armenian genocide, which gave rise to the Aurora project, was when that effort intensified, and it became not about Armenia but about the world. So maybe I'll pause there, but I haven't given you a clear answer of a logical. I will say one thing. In my experience, starting companies, doing innovation, one thing I've learned is there's a human tendency to describe what happened with the benefit of knowing the end. And then there's, I tell people there's a difference between rationale and rationalization. You asked me what's the rationale, I didn't have one. I can give you lots of rationalizations. The later in life, the more they look beautiful and logical. Nothing of that was true. Very emergent.
Like many great stories, you stumbled into it to some degree. Yeah. But obviously there was this connection point to Armenia, to the history, and maybe 2015 was that critical moment when you had to decide where do you take it. Maybe, Eric, I just want to bring you into the discussion, too, because listening at last night's game...
I'd rather just listen to Noubar.
No.
I could listen to each of you.
He's the chief. I'm older.
There's a clear connection when you think about the spirit animating the Armenian community that was so present in last night's event, your own work, the history, right? The history, Noubar's history is dramatic in a way, but it's also common in a sense in the Armenian community, going from one country to the next and forced from one place to the next. You have your own family history. When you think of what drove you, you're a noted, distinguished physician. You've worked in so many other areas. Why this?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you. I echo Noubar's comments. I'm so honored to be in the room with all of you, especially with my dear friend Noubar here. And it's remarkable to see the level of interest and enthusiasm for the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative and everybody gathering here at UCLA and the Promise Institute. For me, as you mentioned, many of us share similar stories, and they're so powerful in and of themselves, and then collectively, they're even more powerful. There's no way to quantify the power. My great-grandparents were genocide survivors, and we also have had kind of like a nomadic existence in my family, and basically in Turkey, modern-day Turkey, but Constantinople and and Western Armenia, or in Van. And then basically my great-grandparents met in Iraq and then went to Iran. My parents were born in Iran. I was actually born in the United States, believe it or not, because my father was getting a master's degree, MBA, but then we went to Iran. So we actually went from the United States to Iran and then came here literally as kind of refugees. And so for me, you know, our family story has always been told to each other. It has been central, but you know, we were always trying to just do the best we could. And I always, either my parents told me I always wanted to be a doctor, or I always remember myself wanting to be a doctor, one or the other. It does work actually, as for those of you who are parents, because my parents always tell me a story about certain things, and I was like, I don't know if that actually happened, but I definitely, you know, I always loved the idea of trying to help as many people as possible. And I joked in the morning session, I went to UC Berkeley undergrad, although I'm a Bruin, and I love both institutions, a sister institution. But I initially studied biology and English. And my parents, you know, if you've had immigrant parents too, at some point my father said, don't you speak English? Why are you taking all these English classes? So I ended up minoring in English, actually. But I always loved storytelling, and I loved the idea of also trying to help people and be a physician. And at Berkeley, I was actually introduced to public health, and I ended up being a teacher's assistant for public health. And I loved the idea of potentially helping more people than just the person in front of you. So I actually pursued medical school thinking about patient care, you know, kind of bigger issues than just, you know, the individual patient, thinking about communities. And then at UCLA, I had the opportunity to put it all together. And actually, I chose UCLA for my fellowship training because I had the opportunity to get a master's of public health at UCLA. But in parallel, I, of course, always remembered, you know, kind of my heritage and how we ended up coming to this country, and the fact that this community, the Armenian community, is so remarkable for its resilience and perseverance. And so, you know, I think for me, it's always been, I have to just say, I've been truly, truly blessed in my life to have the most incredible friends and mentors. And there are times that I feel, for those of you who are older, there's a Woody Allen movie called Zelig, or for the younger audience, Forrest Gump. But I have been in like every single situation, and I don't understand even how I got there. But somehow I did, and I have a lot of faith, and I feel kind of God has put all these different people in my path and has, you know, guided me. And Kirk Kerkorian was one of my life mentors, incredible person, generous philanthropist who helped not only Armenia, but the world in so many different ways. He financed the film The Promise, helped us to do a lot of amazing things. You mentioned Vatche and Tamar Manoukian. Vatche and Tamar Manoukian are also like family to me. They have supported me in everything I've ever done. They're the first people that took me to Armenia. I'd never been to Armenia. I went with them. Vatche said, you're supposed to be Armenian. You've never been to Armenia. So, you know, get on the plane and you're going. I was like, okay.
How old were you at the time?
I was only 2012, actually. So it wasn't that long ago. But since then, I've gone many times. And then, of course, people like Noubar Afeyan, who I admire and respect so much, and his family, I love them very much. And, you know, just a remarkable person. And you know his story, but came to this country, has risen to the top of his professions, I should say, and yet constantly thinks about his heritage, constantly thinks about helping other people, using his platform to do that. So for me, I mean, I've just been surrounded by the most incredible people, and I actually met Ruben through, you know, Noubar and Ruben together as they were thinking about this initiative, and it's, you know, it's so impressive for me to see where it's gone, and I'm just honored to be a part of it. Well, so sorry I rambled, but
no, not at all. And yeah, I think we're going to hear, and you'll get the sense, if you don't already know, how remarkable both of these two gentlemen are. But just getting back to that moment, that 2015 moment, when you had to think of, okay, you want to do something philanthropic, you want to mark this moment in history, but you decided to do something a little bit, I don't know, non-traditional. You said that you like to be a little bit ahead in your business career, and you were a little bit ahead here too. You said, we're going to mark this moment of 100 years since the Armenian genocide, not by just doing something in Armenia or for Armenians, but for others, to celebrate humanitarianism elsewhere. Take us to that moment, that decision. How did you come to it?
I will, and let me just take one step back to your prior question, because when you said what motivated this, and I said the rationale and rationalization, probably the one driving force in my life for this type of activity has been a great aunt who I lived with. It so happened in my family that my grandfather's sister, who was about 75 years old when I was born and passed away at 101, was a person who I shared a room with from my 3rd day on this planet till the 20th year. And so imagine growing up with somebody who has gone through the genocide. She was not affected, but her brothers were. So I didn't need to read books or hear stories. I mean, her brothers went through that for several years. And then she had gone to Greece with her husband, who was a doctor. And then during World War II, they had a cataract clinic. They literally treated thousands of people. And so kind of I grew up in her influence. And she kind of really instilled this notion that, you know, we have to do whatever it takes to get back. Not to get back at who perpetrated these, but to get back to where we were and beyond that as a small nation, a very, very old nation. And I think those things subliminally definitely kind of created this need to do something useful. And so coming to 2015, to your question, you know, a year earlier, 2014, because we were doing so many different things in Armenia together with Ruben, we kind of started thinking, well, what are we going to do for the centennial? And the most original thing we could think about was a project we called 100 Lives. And the idea was to find 100 people who had pretty good documentation about how it is that their ancestors had survived, who had saved them, and bring to life the stories. As Eric said, the storytelling is an important thing. This is even before the Shoah Foundation was doing the interviews and the like, and in fact there was some crosstalk there. So we kind of ventured into that, started that project, and then we started thinking, okay, but at the end of this, we're not going to have 100 more stories of things that are quite similar to Rwanda and to lots of places where this has happened. And at the end, like, great, we tell our story, but then what? And that's when we started thinking, okay, but then what do you do, given that this is a centennial, this is 100 years. This is not a fresh wound. This is a wound that has been passed on generation after generation. I mean, as somebody who works in biology, I can tell you that there's ample evidence to show that there are epigenetic changes in cells as a result of trauma that are transmitted. This has been well shown. And I'm not saying that that's the reason we feel this way, but it probably makes us vulnerable to these feelings, and any more than people are vulnerable to other kinds of things that they carry generationally. So what we started thinking about is, what would be something more, let's say, dignified to do in the memory of these folks. And what occurred to us, and I can't, pin down exactly who said what to whom, but the three of us at this time, we were also seeking input from Vartan Grigorian. Vartan, the late Vartan Grigorian, was truly kind of N of one, not just as an Armenian, but as an American, really unusual, extraordinary person. And we were fortunate to have met him. And he was kind of quite encouraging of us, not thinking, Dave Carnegie has their freedom medals and the immigrant medals, so they have done lots of things. And so he's thinking we really should think about this in a kind of de novo way. So the thing that occurred to us in the Armenian context, we talk often about Armenians kind of being the product of survival. So if you think about, what trait do Armenians represent, not that different than the Jewish history, we are the product of repeated temptations of being extinguished. So what you become then is a super survivor. So at any given situation, you know exactly what to do to either kind of hide or comply or escape, but you just do that. So this notion that surviving and thriving are kind of really the two modes that you find yourself in. The reason that was important is that we said, okay, but what happened in the genocide? Well, in a genocide, you have perpetrators and you have victims. And a lot is said about them. So that explosive moment, evil moment, perpetrators and victims. But there are I have a physicist brother who can tell you what particles are born out of these explosions. There are two other forms that form in that moment. One is a survivor and the other is a savior. We hardly ever use the word savior because it's a religious concept, but actually they are literally just saviors. They save people's lives. So the question is, why are people not as much covering this? Well, we know lots of people who've saved lots of names. The Wallenberg family, different families that a lot has been written about in Europe during the Holocaust. But this, in the Armenian context, not as much. You know, people passed laws to help us, gave us, but the individual, Morgenthau reported it. So, long way of saying, the genesis of this was to say, what if we captured the survivor-savior side of this? And then we thought, well, what are we going to do? Recount those stories, that's 100 lives. But then we said, well, isn't this just happening also today? And that temporal shift from 100 years ago to today brought us to saying, well, it's not Armenians who saved Armenians' lives. In fact, it's knowably not Armenians. It was actually Germans and Turks and French people and Kurds and Syrians. So we thought, well, so we're going to go thank all of them? Or can we find, regardless of where this is happening, people today that are channeling that same human instinct of not looking away, but actually walking towards that peril? And when you talk to such people, and we've met hundreds and thousands of such people since, it's hard for them to explain why they did it, except they just did it. They just got drawn in that moment. It's a little like, you know, you see an accident, do you just keep driving by or do you stop and help? These are people who were doing it at risking their lives. So it felt super appropriate that we would infect new people with that same feeling that we got by being given a chance to start all over again. So we call this second chance. By the way, we haven't used the terminology a lot, but we had a second chance project that we wanted to advance, we still do, which is, what do you do when you're given a second chance at life? That's what survivors are. When you have, and I'll cut it short too, sorry, we both can go on, but I won't.
No, I mean, I love listening.
End this. So you know, when you're a survivor, you're given a second chance. And people, there aren't that much written about this, there's some. The one thing that's always stuck with me when I read about this is that when you're born into this world, you have parents. When you're reborn into this world, out of that moment of second chance, you actually have no parents. For the rest of your life, you're the product of some event that you didn't orchestrate, your parents didn't orchestrate, and yet you start all over again. And a lot of people kind of lose their sense of what they're living for and seek a new meaning in their lives. They're super disrupted by that event, and a lot of them get depressed over this, and they get some form of post-traumatic stress. But other people come back with a vengeance and kind of take on a meaning. Elie Wiesel, you know, talked about this. There's a lot, Mandela talked about this. It's like, you get a second chance and you feel like, I'm going to do something. So what our heroes, what our finalists all share is that notion that they give a second chance, and then the people who survive now have to say, what am I going to do to add to that? So those were the thinking that we had in those early days.
I think of Dennis Mukwege, who won your award this year, and being the kind of person who is faced with an impossible situation and decides to go deeper into the challenge instead of running away from it. And I think about that moment in 2015, this beginning of the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, this big decision that was made to focus on humanitarianism broadly. And I just wonder, Eric, maybe to get your thoughts about that. It's now been 8 years you've been doing this, celebrating these amazing humanitarians around the world, shedding light on them. Yes, there's funding, but that's maybe the least of it in a sense. You're lifting them up. What have you taken away from these last 8 years of doing this work?
Well, I mean, again, I've been honored to kind of witness so much of it from afar, but as our relationships have gotten closer over the years, now to be a part of not just this event, but to be a part of the organization means so much to me. And I think truly I'm inspired by the laureates, but also all the people who are considered to be laureates, and all the people who are doing so much of this work that is unrecognized. You know, I mean, for me, I think, you know, again, maybe it's just, not to get too religious, but maybe, you know, faith has a lot to do with it. But I think some of the most remarkable people do work without any recognition in corners around the world, in villages, in orphanages, in food, you know, banks and soup kitchens, I mean, including in this country. And they don't get the recognition. So one thing I love about the initiative is just highlighting individuals and then hopefully not only helping their organizations and the people they work with, but I think hopefully inspiring people. Like, again, for me, just to keep it on a granular level, I can go back in my life and trace all of these relationships and how they connect to one another and how they've inspired me. And many of the people, I regret that I haven't been able to express my gratitude. So that's why I love the concept of gratitude with Aurora, because I think for me, I'm trying as much as I can while these people are alive to let them know that, kind of the opportunities they gave me made such a big difference. And I've been so fortunate because each one of these individuals, and many of them are not people you've ever heard of. It's a teacher. It was a person who, maybe kind of opened a door for me, and they created an opportunity for me. But each one of those projects has been successful in some way. And again, it's like those are the laureates, but then there's another layer of people that are just like those laureates, but without the visibility. And I hope we have a chance to celebrate them somehow too.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. And I just, I think one of the things people in this room are grappling with, just listening to the conversations of the last couple of days, is the reality of the world today, right? It can be tempting to say, well, 100 years ago, that was then. Things are different now. And then you hear stories like the ones we've heard this week from people who are going through very similar kinds of situations all over the world, even now. And I wonder how you process that. You said something interesting, Eric, earlier, that you could work patient by patient as a clinician, but at some point you thought, I've got to pull back and look at the public health challenge because there's an opportunity to do more. How do you think about the humanitarian crises going on around the world today and kind of the moment we're living in? What's your big picture view about it?
Well, I think, if anything, I try not to get discouraged because I'm optimistic about human beings and humanity, despite all the horror that we hear about, because these problems are not new. I mean, if we go back in human history, there have been atrocities. Prior to the Armenian genocide, there are clearly genocides. Native Americans in this country, African Americans in this country, but I think when you go back even deeper, you realize, I mean, the number of people who have died in different types of conflicts or abuses of human rights, if you will, it's really staggering. Nevertheless, here we are. Now we have the ability to document things. We have the ability to capture images. Technology is unfortunately maybe facilitating our ability to harm others from a distance. Nevertheless, I think we've been through this before, and that's why I think about the Armenians now. When I think about Ruben and the victims of Artsakh and the leaders that are responsible for a lot of these behaviors, you know that they're not going to last forever, and Armenians have been resilient over centuries, and our faith, in my opinion, has helped us tremendously, which is why I think it's really important for us to recognize that and talk about that, the role of the Armenian Church and the resilience and the survival of our people. But I mean, that's just one population, and so I don't get discouraged. I do think, though, that we have to kind of maybe adapt periodically to say, okay, so if we keep trying something, it's not working, we have to try a different channel. I love the fact that we have the presence of so many human rights lawyers in the room today, because the legal channels are obviously things that we have to utilize and employ, but also just sharing the stories of these individuals, because their stories hopefully will inspire others not to lose hope and motivate them to maybe pursue different avenues in terms of education or professions, and collectively make decisions. At some point, somebody ends up getting into a position where they make a decision. And that's when I was sharing with somebody yesterday. I think it's people like Noubar become as successful as you can in a particular area, so that when you have an opportunity to make a decision or go down a path, left or right, or push a button, and help somebody or cut off aid to somebody that's harming others, that you do that. Somebody is in those seats. And talking about seats, I feel like we're negotiating. The white table is very, it's recognizable when you see people going into the heads of state and across the table. But I think, maybe we can inspire somebody when they're sitting at the table and making a decision. What path are they going to take? I think that's ultimately what we can do, because we can, raise foreign aid and we can lobby Congress and we can do all these kinds of things. But I don't know if that really actually moves the needle. I think it takes individuals making big decisions. And I can tell you that one of my professors once, when I was hedging on what to do with a patient, he said, MD stands for make decisions. And he said, you have to make a decision. And another anecdote, I remember one time with Mr. Krikorian, we were talking about doing something and, could I do it? And, did I want to make a certain investment? And he said he went into 100 businesses in his life and didn't know a single thing about any of them. That's what he told me. I mean, and yet he was, eminently successful. So I think once you're in a position that you can make a decision, make the right one. And you can be inspired by people like Dr. Mukwege or others to do that.
I love this idea of this moment. There's like a crucible moment for individuals and you have to pick. And I guess right now, a lot of people feel they're in this kind of crucible moment as humanity, right? Where many things have changed. There's AI, for example, but we're looking at a shifting climate. We're looking at more conflicts than we've seen, a greater number of displaced people in the world than at any time in modern history, over almost 120 million people forced to leave their homes now around the world. When you look at the world, Noubar, how do you see it? How do you see, you're a man who's, I don't know, how many patents have you helped to put into this world? Hundreds?
100, 150, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, you think about the future and what's coming, but how do you make sense of the world we're living in now, given how tragic so many of the circumstances are people are going through?
I don't. I don't try to make sense, but I'll comment on a couple of things that Eric said. One is, he said he's an optimist. In the world I live in, which is kind of envisioning totally new breakthrough technologies and trying to create companies, I've for a long, long time thought that the mindset has to be paranoid optimism. So you have to be optimistic enough not to give up and to believe you can do things that nobody else believes you can, and you have to be paranoid enough not to think that you actually can, and that you kind of constantly check the assumptions and over, and that iteration skill, which is not what an optimist would do. An optimist would just kind of say, I got this, but actually the doubt. So paranoid optimism to me is equally applicable in the startup world as it is in this world, which is that you kind of don't, even starting projects like this, you don't assume it's going to work. You need to believe it can work and that you're willing to do the work. But so that combination. The other thing that Eric mentioned, and I'll just expand on, I was thinking, like, and you said, well, like, why does this keep happening in the world? Look, it's pretty clear that it's all about power. And, Vartan Gregorian, late Vartan Gregorian used to say, in fact, it kind of has a quote in a Brown University alumni magazine that I found one time. And they said to him, what do you think, how did you become so powerful? And he said, I've never wanted power in my life. He said, I always wanted knowledge. It just so happens that knowledge is power. and that always stuck with me, because I think that, we're in UCLA, kind of a bastion of education. Why do we want people to get educated? Yes, it's to create new things. Yes, it's to advance the arts and science, etc., law. But beyond that is to actually give them a deterrent to just seeking power, and avoid the middle ground of getting knowledge and figuring out how, because knowledge will make you actually think twice about some of the things you're doing. So I actually do think that this will sound harsh, but I believe it, there's a form of ignorance underlying what it is that drives people to just get power and short circuit actually being exposed to the very things that we are here exposing to the world, awakening the world to. So if we can add to the knowledge of people, to understand the human condition that these atrocities are putting people in, the denial of their human rights everywhere. Yesterday we had folks that we described from Iran, from Bahrain, from the DRC, hundreds of places we've really looked at. So I think we do have a responsibility now with AI that you kind of referred to. AI is a tool to gain knowledge just as much as it is to fake knowledge. But the gaining knowledge, getting people in the most consumable way to be able to access and be confronted by. I mean, it's almost like you got to hold a mirror to people. If they can't recognize the image, then they're just going to look away. But if they can recognize the image and say, like, this is what you're doing, that is a very different thing. So I think all this speaking truth to power, all those things are roundabout ways of saying, how do we get knowledge? How do we get people to feel responsible once they have that knowledge? Those are things that, but otherwise, climate change, disease that's inevitably going to follow as a result of climate change that will be rampant, inequities, poverty. The last thing I could imagine being, and thank God I didn't meander into it, is in any form of government. Because that that to me is an incredible way to satisfy your power hunger. On the other hand, you also hold all the tools to be able to do something about it. And I just think that it's that part of our society is really, really broken. It's hard to point to a governance system and a government which actually is doing justice to how advanced humans have become. All you can see is different extents of either taking advantage of their responsibilities and benefiting themselves, or being inadequate and being able to do it. Now, there's some places where they get closer and closer to ideal, but anyway, that's my view. I don't have a better sense about what's going on.
Can I just make one more comment? I was going to say that, you know, as you were talking, Noubar, I also thought about the fact that, you know, the atrocities or the inhumanity we see now is not because of modern technology. I mean, Dennis's work, you know, rape as a weapon, it's so barbaric, but it's probably been happening since the beginning of time. So it's you know, when you look at the Armenian genocides in 1915, over 100 years ago, the forced migration, starvation, you know, murder, very similar to what happens in 2024. So we have all this technology, we have robots and lasers, but that's not what is being used. It's still a person doing a bad thing to another person. And therefore, I think lifting up the stories and celebrating the heroes and inspiring, hopefully, another generation. And like you said, when you come to that Rubicon, making a decision, you know, can you help somebody or are you going to harm somebody? And resisting, you know, any possible pressure to go that harmful route and do the right thing.
You know, the humanitarian system includes UN agencies, governments, and you both have sounded a little skeptical about kind of how government is working, how kind of foreign aid as a solution, maybe it isn't the solution itself. And the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative has done something kind of interesting, which is you give a grant to the laureate you select, but then you ask them to re-grant most of that money to even smaller local organizations that we sitting here in Los Angeles may have never been able to hear of. They might not have a website or they might not have that kind of presence. Take us through that kind of theory of change that you have. You know, it sounds like you believe the solutions are out there, but they're at this micro level. They're not sitting in the halls of power somewhere.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, some of that comes from, again, like I find myself, I thought that this was going to be a complete, you know, other world than the startup world that I live in, but there are so many parallels. So in the startup world, we think of incumbents and we think of insurgents. And incumbents have all the advantages. They have the money, they have the brand, they have relationships with the markets, they dominate. And so what can insurgents do? Take crazy risks and do things that the incumbent at all doesn't believe can happen, but then survive long enough to gain some advantage and then be able to compete. Well, the insurgent mentality is the individual humanitarian mentality. There's not, first of all, let me say categorically, I think that humanitarian organizations do an incredible amount of good. The evidence would be, without them, we'd be much worse off. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about this. We'd be, you know, kind of in chaos. So no doubt, especially in this country, in the U.S., ironically, I'll mention to you, you may not know as much, that to the best documentation we have, it was during the Armenian genocide that the first nonprofit organizations, the Near East Relief Foundation, was formed, was ratified by Congress as an entity that could go collect money from Americans. People they used to give money to churches before, and church was the way a lot of this happened. But a non-religious entity, body formed to provide aid outside, it was, as best I've seen, Near East Relief Foundation. So it's quite interesting that 100 years ago this movement happened. Literally the equivalent of $300 million of current money was raised in New York, relatively short period of time, and definitely not coming from Armenians, because there weren't that many wealthy Armenians in the early part of the last century. So I think that So let me just say unequivocally, we're not critical of that part. That generosity at the societal level is there. But that doesn't stop, because you need insurgents who are actually coming up with new models, new attempts, and we need to empower them. And our sense is that, you know, we go around saying, like, let's put human into humanitarian. But let's also create a movement, and the movement is humanitarianism. It's the act of being a humanitarian, right? So if you think about entrepreneurship, it's the state of being an entrepreneur, right? It's a bit of a, you know, redundant, kind of a cyclical definition. Humanitarianism as a thing, right? So manifests in defending human rights, manifests in providing physical direct assistance, saving. All of that, I think we can be, I believe 10, 20, 30 years from now, we're going to look back and say we were in the very early innings of humanitarianism, which at its base is giving money, assistance, but then in a much more profound way and can be a part, like wouldn't it be great if a lot of the top graduates from the colleges actually say, you know what, I'm going to go and actually become a professional humanitarian individually, as opposed to join an institution that does this. And that entrepreneurial humanitarianism, if I can call it that, I think is a very interesting concept. That's why we're drawn to it. It's augmenting, it's not replacing the institutions.
And can I just say one more thing? Noubar mentioned the Near East Relief organization and movement. For those of you who are going to go see Aurora Sunrise later today, Aurora is highlighted, Aurora Mardiganyan, Arshalus, and her whole story and that movement, and it's pretty remarkable to see what they accomplished back then without really any modern technology in the ability to rally so many people towards a cause. But nevertheless, I think, as Noubar said, I think that, imagine if the best and the brightest made a decision, not necessarily to work for an NGO, which is still admirable, but to basically dedicate their lives and a portion of their lives of everything they do with this concept. It would actually change the world.
Maybe I should just say one thing on this, because this, I don't know if we have it on our website, but we should, just as a credit, because look, I think both of us are kind of immigrants, or our parents are. This country has done an amazing amount in this regard. There is a famous picture from 1921-22 from an orphanage in Gyumri in Armenia. It's a region where a lot of the people who did get away ended up going. So these are all abandoned orphans by the thousands. American kind of Near East Relief set up this orphanage, and there's a just iconic picture of hundreds of these kids lined up, and a picture from above, I don't know how they took it, which just spells thank you to the US.
Amazing.
That's 100 years ago.
Yeah.
It's incredible to think, what's possible when people have this idea of being a humanitarian at the individual level, and how powerful that can be, versus a sense that, no, that's someone else's job. That's this agency or this nameless, faceless institution. And what you're both saying, I think, is this is something that everyone can adopt, this idea. We're going to go and hear some questions from the crowd we've got here in a second. I just want to hear from both of you before we do that about where we're going. You mentioned that the original idea behind this initiative was that it would last for 8 years, which was the period of the Armenian genocide. And now you've decided to take it further. Next year will be the 10th year of this initiative. Where is it going? What's the future look like?
Well, I think we will always stay emergent in that we will do some experiments, learn from them and grow them, or else kind of replace them. And so it's hard to be prescriptive. But in general, usually one thinks about, when you're doing a startup, you think about what's the unmet need, where do you have a sustainable advantage, and what's the size of that need. And I'd say in this regard, unfortunately, the size of the need is growing, and it's boundless, it's global, and the refugee crisis, which was largely economic, will soon become climate-driven. And so, I think that if there's, 1,000 retail humanitarians in every community, it won't be enough for the world that we're going into. And it won't be very long before we're in that mode of chaos. I think governments today are rattling because of, kind of some of their internal issues. Wait till that becomes external. I mean, the Mexico border issue that the US faces will be a relatively peaceful time when actually migration starts happening, because people have the right to live, and they're not going to be able to live in a lot of these places. I'm not an alarmist, but I think we need to get ready for that. So I think that going forward, the need is growing. The opportunity is, again, complementing government level work with individual. Mind you, a lot of governments around the world don't have either desire or the means to actually participate in this level of giving, but their individual humans do, right? So how much philanthropic giving is a place like China doing, or is a place like different countries, they're at a different place in their economic cycle. Why don't we just get the people to actually take this on? How does that affect their relationships? So I think if we can, we're not going to do this on our own. This is all, it's easy to dream. It's really hard to do. So what of this can we do? grow this platform to see how we can play a reasonable part of an organizing role, a convening role, bringing knowledge and awareness to people, resources, and we'll see. It's not. There's a permanence that we're trying to establish to this by virtue of the prize and the kind of cycles of this, because we think that there is something good to be learned out of prior prizes. In fact, I'll give you the one other point, is that one of the things we're thinking carefully about is, in the world there's plenty of prizes and activities that reward organizations, but individuals you really rather see in sciences or in arts, where it's about the individual. And we're trying to actually cross those two and say, if we bring the attention, if we want the 10-year-old to be kind of just completely swept up by what a human can do, make sure that when in the future, so here's a test we can do when we meet again in 10 years and have discussion. I say humanitarian, word association, what do you say? You say relief, fund, help, money, intervention. You never say a human being's name. No, I say biologist, you might say Catalin Carrico, you might say David Baltimore. What is that? Well, the answer is ultimately the attention has come up, has not been on the human. So that's as much as we can foresee. Now, hopefully with a lot of partnership. By the way, I should also say that the partnership with the Promise Institute that we're here as a result of is a force multiplier, and we want to do these kinds of partnerships. But I think it's a worthy thing to do. And a lot of times people go, well, what would you be disappointed if it didn't happen? And the answer is there's no such thing. Like a paranoid optimist is set up not to be disappointed and not to be appointed. So you constantly are toggling and you're going, just keep trying, That's how we think about it.
Well, the fact that you said, it's one thing to dream, it's another thing to do. You've got a track record of doing both, so we want to know what those dreams are. That is a very inspiring dream. What are your thoughts on where this goes from here?
Yeah, again, to build on the optimism, I think it's limitless. I think the more people understand about the initiative and the laureates and the work that's being done, and the more we promote it and cross-promote, the amazing partnerships that I see happening just in this couple days alone with Promise Institute for Human Rights, Clooney Foundation for Justice, and the different organizations that are run by our laureates and their colleagues. Just remarkable. And I don't think enough people know about them. And so I think we don't want these humanitarians to be the best kept secret in the world, because I think, if anything, we celebrate some of the wrong people sometimes in society. I don't think so many of these humanitarians have, are considered social media influencers, for example. Maybe they should be. These are the people that I would like young people to look up to. And I don't think that there is any, kind of risk that we shouldn't be taking in this regard, because, I think if you don't want to be criticized, don't do anything interesting. That's the bottom line. And I can say, if somebody said, oh, well, Aurora didn't do this or Aurora didn't do that, literally the people who are part of this initiative do more for the world before 10 a.m. than, their critics do. So I just think that you can't listen to the noise. You just have to plow forward, and everything I do that way. I tell my, anybody I mentor, I basically say, look, you have to do what's right. You have to know in your heart what you're doing, and periodically you need reality checks. Talk to Noubar, talk to a few other people. Am I crazy? But if you get kind of validation from people you trust, you just go forward and don't kind of wait for validation from people you don't respect or trust. It doesn't make any sense. And I think that's what the heroes that we've been celebrating and talking about, that's what they've done. Because if somebody said to them, don't take that risk, it's dangerous for you, they wouldn't have done it. And I think, again, you think about people like Ruben Vardanyan, who basically, he could live probably the best life in the world if he did anything but what he did. He could be, by all measures, economically, socially, he could be living an amazing life. But what he chose to do was to try to go help these people in Artsakh. And so it's very brave and admirable.
I think one thing I'll add to that, you said earlier, people may not know, kind of, they're not prepared for this, etc. I think it's certainly, as based on this interview, you now know that neither Eric nor I have any idea how to do what any of this stuff. So that's one. So it's not an excuse if anybody in the room isn't engaged to say, well, I don't know how to do this, I didn't study this. But moreover, let me give two examples that happened the last day. You saw last night at the Aurora event, Aloe Black. Aloe Black, a fantastic artist. I happened to have a chance meeting together with Anna, my wife, at a conference we were both at, of all things about biotechnology, because he's taken an interest in helping biotech innovators advance their companies from a kind of a philanthropic standpoint, and he's interested in the topic. We met, and he said, well, you know, what do you do? What else do you do, etc. I told him about Aurora, and he said, look, I'd like to write a song and dedicate it to Aurora, and then so bring the world's attention. Last night at 9 o'clock, he released a song called Shine, which anybody watching this program should go and listen to. And so what is he? He is a musician philanthropist. Jose Andres, we saw, and a humanitarian. Jose Andres, a world-class chef, drawn to what? Drawn to the humanitarian aspect of that work. It's the highest form that you can get to. So what is he? A chef humanitarian, right? So you know, I'm a scientist humanitarian. You're a make decisions humanitarian. I'm just kidding. I'm joking. But let me look at Eric, right? Eric, who's a world-class, very well-known MD and leader in the field, wants to make a movie. That's not, he doesn't want to make a movie. He wants to make a movie to tell a story that teaches the world, brings it to, so everybody in the room can be two things. You don't have to be one thing. Whatever you are, you can be a construction worker and humanitarian. And so
I would say
think
be more than two, even. You know,
Let's see if we can get some of our incredible audience here engaged. We'll take 3 questions, and we'll just ask you to keep them fairly brief if you can, and tell us your name and your organization, and try to have a question mark at the end. That would be fantastic. Please go ahead.
My question is to Noubar. My name is Sunitha Krishnan. I work on human trafficking in India. Noubar, in the last 10 years, you have accumulated a lot of extraordinary humanitarians as a part of the Aurora Prize. Do you anyway propose to leverage this human strength to address some of the world issues, pressing global concerns across the world?
Thank you. And we'll just take a couple more. Next, you go ahead, and then we'll pass.
Thank you so much, Khalid Ibrahim, originally from Baghdad. On behalf of the community of human rights defenders, knowing that Aurora initiative, a humanitarian initiative, is well connected with a lot of generous, rich people, I suggest that you put an award to human rights protection. This is very important. We have a human rights crisis in many countries. And imagine if you put, say $1 million US in a human rights movement in an oppressed country, that will create a generation, a new generation of human rights defenders, and we are connected. In Saudi Arabia, for example, they are putting every peaceful voice behind bars. Who let out the terrorists who are attacking Baghdad and Paris, Boston and New York? So I suggest to consider that.
Thank you.
That's all what I have. Thank you so much.
We'll just pass the mic to the other side. We'll take one more, and then if we have time, we'll come back for others.
Hey, Sasha Chanoff, the ambassador for the Aurora Prize, founder of Refuge Point and board member of Network of Engaged International Donors. You guys are good at thinking on your feet, and you're talking about what Aurora can be in the future, what it looks like, and what the world looks like 20 or 30 years from now. How do you put Aurora Prize, Aurora Humanitarian Initiative resources toward becoming the place that triggers this humanitarian action, that triggers people to say, I am this and a humanitarian? What do you do to make that happen?
Okay, 3 fantastic questions. Maybe we start with Sasha's question there at the end, because you do have a big vision. I mean, this is a big, bold idea that everyone should have humanitarian at the end of their name. And you've got this incredible platform you've now built over 8+ years. How do you connect those things together? I'd love to hear both of you take on that.
Well, so first of all, Sasha is not only an ambassador, but he's a close friend and has been super at guiding us in forming and growing Aurora. So his question is even more informed and rooted in the fact that he knows what we are and he knows what we aren't yet. But like anything, Sasha, no good question goes unpunished. And the simple answer to the question is, you and others should help us do that. I have no idea how we do that. We have the platform, we're open to collaboration, and we also know that we don't want to spend resources needlessly to do the same thing. There's a lot of us in the same community. You have done a tremendous job through Refuge Point, helping refugees, giving them a dignified life, bringing them to this country and everywhere else in the world. You have idea after idea. If you think we have ideas, you should hear his ideas. And Basi's a doer, but we would love to collaborate on this. You saw Hamdi Ulukaya yesterday, heavy investment he's made in giving refugees jobs. So we want to talk to different folks. You know, Arman, the team at Aurora is, you know, what we're doing is we're saying we really want to aspire to that. We want to build a new wing to this activity. But how we do that, I think we're going to respond to ideas. I'm not shunning the question, but you know, if you look 3 years back, there's been a bunch of changes we've made, including going beyond 8 years, including trying to become much more focused on humanitarian. And to the question about, for example, this community of humanitarians we've built, you know, one of the things we're beginning to do is to bring all of that together and have that represent a much stronger collective voice. But then you're asking the question, okay, what policies come from that? What recommendations come from that? Well, you have elders, you have lots of organizations that are already taking the mantra on telling the world, you know, kind of what's morally correct, etc. So we have to find our own version of that. So almost like a collection of entrepreneurial humanitarians that come together and say, okay, what's our voice? What's the insurgent view of these positive insurgent views? So a lot of work to do, but you're in our community and you need to help us. And I really mean this. You might have seen we changed ever so gradually the actual use of the prize proceeds now and going forward, which is that before we were giving it to 2 or 3 organizations, large organizations, whose work the laureate was supporting. Now we're saying we want to break it down into smaller pieces and give it to a community of practitioners, including all of the finalists and laureates who then are part of that community. So more work to do, but I think Eric, you may have additional.
No, I mean, just I'm inspired by your response, but also the questions. I think, you know, to be a multi-hyphenate is not just about money. I mean, that's one thing I want to really clarify is that, you know, it's like the Aurora Prize. Of course, the money is important to help these organizations or individuals, but it's the behavior, I think, that is, to me, I mean, again, not to get too religious, but I do think the behavior is something that is something I hope that we can motivate people to act a certain way, like the laureates. The decisions that they've made in their lives. It's, you know, I think when people say, you know, can I have a meeting? You know, I know, unfortunately, a lot of those meetings, not in like in my business life, but unfortunately, if it's a stranger, usually it's about money, you know, and they think they're going to accomplish everything that they want to accomplish if they get some money. And it's really not, you know, I really try to drill down on their ambition and what do they want to do and what do they do in their free time and what are their interests and who inspires them. And if they're inspired just by wealth and fame and celebrity and things like that, you know, that's a problem. I want them to be inspired by Dennis Mukwege. You know, I want that to be the person whose picture is on their wall. Not to take away from artists and stuff, because, you know, we all have heroes in that regard as well. But it shouldn't always be an athlete. It shouldn't always be an entertainer. You know, why is the Instagram feed on so many young people only cars and, you know, material things and not work being done in their community? You know, so that, and again, not to sound too naive, you know, all of these things build our world. But I think I would love to see us help elevate. So, you know, it's a tangential kind of response. But in my mind, what we should be doing is really sharing the story of Aurora, building on this, you know, few days, touching base with all these like-minded people, sharing each other's contacts, utilizing, you know, again, I'm not a fan of social media, but one thing I do think social media can be good for is sharing the work of organizations and individuals, and trying to inspire people to, what do you spend your free time on? I ask people that all the time, you know, and what are your hobbies? And, you know, I may be kind of pathological sometimes because I don't have a lot of those hobbies. You know,
This is it.
yeah, my free time. Yeah, I mean, literally, my free time is trying to help other people do a lot of things. You know, and so for me, but that selfishly, I do get actually satisfaction from that. I actually feel like that. I'm being selfish because the more I'm doing it, the better I feel.
Yeah.
So I'll just make one quick additional comment. In the last 2 days, I've heard twice this notion, so it must be catching steam, from President Clinton, who was at the Milken Institute, gave a talk, and then Zaid Hussein yesterday, talking about tribalism as a source of a lot of conflict and a lot of the challenges we have. Any bad thing can also be used for good. So imagine if we created tribalism aimed at humanitarian activity, and humanitarian not to help your family or your friends, but actually just humanitarian transcends the people close to you. It's meant to be any human. So fine, if we created a global humanitarian tribalism, I think we could counteract that. This notion of tribalism as amplified by social media, in other words, if your social standing went up because you were actually engaged in these things, it became cool. I mean, how many people took a picture yesterday with Aloe Black? Just think about it. Aloe is a terrific guy. But all of a sudden, he's made it cooler, given his meaning, given his involvement, his devotion. What if we had 1,000 such people? And by the way, he's not the only one.
Of course.
Mano has done a ton of things. So I think this tribalism cuts both ways. And if we can create people on that. I did want to make sure on the human rights, because I thought that question, your institute is doing a hell of a lot in that. And so it would be
Khalid
good.
is basically asking, you know, there's so many human rights defenders, people protecting human rights that are silenced by governments around the world. Is there an angle here where Aurora can give them more of a platform? And
well, I think Aurora does that. I think, I mean, because if you think about some of the people who have not only won the prize, but have been nominated, been in the ecosystem, they are human rights defenders.
Exactly.
But I think, again, we don't want Aurora to be the best kept secret. Same thing with the Promise Institute for Human Rights. We don't want we don't want it to be a law school community, known commodity. It should be the type of educational kind of base that then partners with all of the other organizations that are in the world doing the good work, and the work of the Clooney Foundation for Justice. I mean, that's a perfect example, for example, with George and Amal Clooney, using their visibility, and of course Amal's entire profession has been being a human rights lawyer and a prominent one, but using that platform, this is what they've chosen to do. And I wish that we could get more people motivated, and not just for public relations. That's the other thing that I think, for me, I mean, I can see this now from a mile away. You know, and when people say to me, oh, so-and-so is so generous, so-and-so does so much for the world, I usually don't say they don't actually do anything. They don't, you know. But, you know, the ones that do, unfortunately, are not being recognized. And so that's what I really hope we can use collectively, our resources and our visibility and our, kind of organizations, to shine a light on the people who are doing the work. And hopefully, you know, sometimes every once in a while you see, a very prominent person partner with someone who doesn't have the same visibility to elevate them and lift them up. And that's what I hope we can do.
That's a great model too. I know we had more hands, so we have limited time. We're going to try to get them. We can bring a mic over here to Nasra if we would. And I'll just remind everyone, if you can keep it very brief, add a question mark, tell us who you are. Go ahead, Nasra.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Nasra Ismail. I'm the U.S. Executive Director for Alight. We welcome refugees into this country so that we can have a conversation like this much into the future. I'm almost ready to change my LinkedIn profile and sort of the description to say super survivor and no longer former refugee.
Amazing. Yeah, I like it.
Gratitude and action, Sasha and Armin, for the invitation. This is my first Aurora and not my last. My question is, I know democracies like human beings, and I'm pointing at this from a medical perspective to the both of you, they get sick, they get old, they forget their way. If a super survivor is treating the American democracy where it's at, what would be the vitals? How would you treat the areas that it's hurting? Thank you so much.
And if you just pass the question right in front of you, we'll try to see.
I love the idea of how do you create some kind of an educational program to inspire, to educate, and how could you use your laureates, this band of amazing people, to create something that might be relevant and not a top-down method of educating, but really from a grassroots perspective? How could you use them?
Thank you. And we can just pass the mic over to this side. See what?
All right, so since it's short, I think there's a solution, and the solution should be called Humanitarian TV, or Humanitarians TV, or something like this. And it should be like National Geographic, which has all sorts of different programming, which highlights all sorts of ways of being humanitarian. Little children should be able to watch it on Saturday morning. The parents should be able to put them on this thing and say, look at this, what do you think of this, what are you doing? And there's NASA TV, there's all sorts of things of people with niche habits. Humanitarian TV could be multilingual, instead of, so I think something like that. We could start on YouTube, but then should be really its own thing, like National Geographic Channel could have competitions, could have all sorts of things, and this would bring all sorts of humanitarianism to the immediate and normalize it and not make it something exceptional. I'll give you a laser analogy. Lasers can be pulsed or continuous. We need continuous humanitarianism, and this is still pulsed.
Super.
Thank you.
Alice, I think, had one.
Yeah,
do you want to do one last
Okay, let's
one?
go ahead. One more there in the back. I love how much interest there is. We can't get to all of you. Apologies.
Please. Alice Greenwell, I'm an Aurora board member, and just playing off the comments we've just heard, I'm going to pose a challenge rather than a question. And it is Mandy Patinkin, who everyone knows as an actor, singer, actually does a great deal of work with refugees. And he refers to himself as a humanitician, not a humanitarian, because it's about a practice, humanitician. I challenge Eric and Hannah to use the resources of the Promise Institute to spread the word to undergraduates who are in various disciplines. They could be in pre-med, they could be in literature, they can be in history, God willing, history, but any field, mechanical engineering, and make it a requirement to take one course at the Promise Institute, the law school, as an undergraduate, to understand that even if they're on a certain track, being a humanitician is part of their practice. And I think we could change the world that way and get to where Noubar is asking us to go.
So interestingly, we've had, please, we've had three questions all around education.
I love that idea.
Around how do you inspire undergraduates and get them engaged, around is there a way to use the laureates to kind of a bottom-up education approach, humanitarian television, this idea of educating kids. How are you thinking about education and where Aurora can play in that?
Well, can I just say something, just to kind of combine some of these ideas? I think the laureates are incredible. It's almost like if you think about a speakers bureau or visiting professors, the laureates could be like visiting professors because they have full-time jobs because they're trying to save the world. But imagine if people could tap into their wisdom and knowledge and learn from their successes and the challenges that they've dealt with. So I kind of, in my head, I'm imagining, you hear about speakers bureaus, but like those are the types of people who really are the teachers, right? And I love the idea of having it to be a requirement. I'm sure students love requirements, but there's a way to probably make it, there's probably a way to make it really inspiring and fun as well, because I know I've always loved learning from people who are doing amazing things in the world, and it doesn't feel, maybe you don't even have a grade, maybe you just have it pass fail, but that would be an incredible idea. And then Bedros' idea, again, normalizing it, celebrating these heroes. I think collectively we can be doing that and trying to inspire people to behave a certain way. I know that has happened to me so many times in my life. I keep thinking, what would people think if I did this instead of that? What would these people who entrusted me with so much, with their time, more than anything, their time, and I think the people that I seek counsel from now, they have everything in the world, but the one thing they don't have is time. So when they give me their time, I'm very respectful of it. So I think about, and we should celebrate these heroes.
So I'm going to say two quick things, and then we're going to wrap up. On the, how would a super survivor think about the state of the health of countries? That's a much higher than my pay scale. But I would say among the things I would use from a health analogy standpoint, as I mentioned yesterday, is the immune system. So we collectively as a society have effectively an immune system. The rules by which we operate are trying to actually protect us. An immune system has got early surveillance capability and detection of threats. And I think we are now immune compromised. At the end of the day, and worse yet, we're actually autoimmune because we've all turned against ourselves. within a given society. And so there are things you could think about from nature as to how do you deal with that? How do you actually restore? How do you improve our immune health, right? And that leaves alone mental health from a point of view of the overall governance of a country. And so thinking of it as a body, right? Because societies, don't have to exist. We could just exist as nomads and nothing to do with each other. It formed because there was some evolutionary advantage to protect us and to cause progress. That does seem to be under a lot of stress, and both external environmental stress and internal. So I do think there's some interesting things to think about. I do want to say one other thing though before, because I really, as I thought about this, it was kind of stark. I want to make the point just because that connects us. Yeah. So, if I was going to pick a name of an institution, it wouldn't have been Promise, because Promise is like an obligation. And to pick a name like Promise for an institute creates an incredible kind of like I said, a commitment to deliver. But what's interesting, and I was thinking about this during the day, so I'm really like in awe of the fact that they're willing to go there. Promise, in a way, is like the word cure in my business. People talk about treatment because cure is really hard. Treatment is like, I'm willing to try. And then, if it works with you, it works. But boy, cure or a vaccine, so in that regard, though, I'm going to tell you one thing just to connect our two independent organizations that are partnering now, which is that I also remember my dear colleague, Vartan Grigorian. One time we did Aurora in Armenia at dawn, because that's what Aurora means, Arsha Luis, at dawn at the foot of Mount Ararat as the sun was coming up. And one of the points he made, when he didn't make it with the word promise, but I want to connect it, is that the thing about dawn that's actually quite inspiring is that no matter how bad it gets at night, you know that the sun's going to come up. So there is this promise of a sunrise. So between our Aurora and their promise, we can do something.
Amazing. Can I just say, that's amazing. I have just a couple just quick fun facts regarding this, because for those of you who haven't seen the film, I hope you do, but there's a betrothal in the film, The Promise. And the promise, people think, is the promise, the betrothal. It's two characters say, I made a promise. But in our mind, it was really the promise that Mr. Krikorian made to want to get the United States to recognize the Armenian genocide. And if you go back in time, I remember talking to him, after reading my Producing for Dummies book, and I realized, I said, Kirk, no one's going to see this movie, okay? I've done research, I'm a doctor, I spent 2 years studying this, talking to all my friends, the most influential people in the entertainment business, and they said, there's no market in 1915, this is, and so I basically, after trying to talk him out of it for 2 years, he said, we just have to get the Armenian genocide recognized by the United States, which is why we then had a parallel documentary, and we worked with NGOs, and we worked with the Armenian organizations, and we worked with, members of Congress, and eventually the White House, et cetera. And in his mind, again, if you look at television executive or movie executive salaries these days, the amount of money that people earn, and back in that days from Mr. Krikorian, it was like a no-brainer. If we could basically pull these things off and try to get the United States to recognize the Armenian genocide, that he in his mind, even if it would, I don't even want to tell you the amounts of money that he would be willing to spend for that. So the promise was also our commitment to finish the film and then to do all the work that he wanted us to do. So that's I just wanted you to know the kind of the origins of the name, because I think it's very interesting.
And it worked.
And it worked. And in 2017 we had the Promise Institute for Human Rights. 2019 was the Promise Armenian Institute, and then we had the Senate, the House of Representatives, and eventually the executive branch recognized the Armenian genocide. But another fun fact, that Mandy Patinkin actually desperately wanted to play Ambassador Morgenthau in the film. And it's just, most people don't know. And fortunately, we had James Cromwell, and who looks just like Ambassador Morgenthau and did an incredible job and truly memorable. But Mandy Patinkin was shooting Homeland, and he could not come to Malta to shoot. And he was so disappointed. He said, I've learned my lines. Can you guys move the date? And so then you mentioned Mandy Patinkin. I wanted people to know that. It was very interesting. Cool.
Well, listen, I think this has been such an authentic and thoughtful conversation. You can get a sense, I hope you have, as I have, of what comes underneath the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, which, like many big organizations that do a lot of things around the world, can seem a little bit nameless and faceless, but I hope you've had a chance to really understand who's behind it and the work and the spirit that comes behind it. And it's been really an honor to get to spend some time with both of you.
Thank you.
Noubar Afeyan.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you, Ash. Excellent.